first Champions Tour was Senior PGA. It was at Valhalla in Louisville, and since they have played PGAs there and the Ryder Cup there, I didn't quite know what to expect, but I'm going to tell you, I was as nervous as I've ever been, and I was playing well on the PGA Tour.
When Jay Haas finally opened up about the 5 players who made his career feel impossible, fans realized just how brutal the competition really was. At 72, he's naming names, and what he reveals about these rivals shows a side of professional golf most people never see. Jay Haas wasn't just any golfer. This guy turned pro in 1976 after winning the NCAA championship in 1975, and he built a career that most players would dream of. 9 victories on the PGA Tour, 15 wins on the Champions Tour, tying him for 9th all-time on the senior circuit. He even set a record that still stands, making 71 consecutive cuts from 1983 to 1985. That's nearly 2 full years of never missing a weekend, never failing to advance. His consistency was legendary, his durability unmatched. He reached as high as 17th in the world rankings in September 2003, proving he belonged among the elite. But here's the thing about being consistently great. You get a front row seat to watching others be consistently greater, spending his entire prime staring up at 5 players who seemed to occupy a different stratosphere of golf entirely. Before we get into who these players were and why they tortured Haas for decades, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We're breaking down the untold stories from golf's greatest eras. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The first name on Haas's list is Tom Kite, and if you understand what made Kite so difficult, understand why Haas's career felt like climbing a mountain that kept getting taller. Kite wasn't flashy. He didn't have the charisma of some players or the explosive power that made highlight reels. What he had was something far more exhausting to compete against. He simply never made mistakes. 19 PGA Tour wins, a US Open championship in 1992, 2 PGA money list titles, 2 Varden trophies for lowest scoring average. Kite spent 175 weeks in the world's top 10, and his highest ranking was 5th in 1989. But those numbers don't capture what it felt like to play against him week after week. Kite's game was built on precision and patience. Fairways, he hit greens, made putts when it mattered. There was no beating Kite by waiting for him to implode, because he didn't implode. You had to be perfect for 4 straight days, and even then, he might still outlast you. The grinding nature of Kite's dominance was particularly brutal because it offered no hope of a shortcut. Against some players, you could wait for a bad round, a mental mistake, collapse under pressure. Kite eliminated that possibility. His technical mastery, recognized with those Varden trophies for lowest scoring average, meant he was statistically eliminating errors that other players accepted as part of the game. For someone like Haas, who was himself known for consistency, Kite meant facing a mirror image who was just slightly, maddeningly better at the grinding, error-free golf that wins tournaments. And it didn't stop when they got older. Haas defeated Kite at the 2007 Senior Players Championship, proving their rivalry extended across generations, from their prime years straight into their senior careers. That's not just competition, that's decades of psychological warfare. Curtis Strange represents something even more personal for Haas. They knew each other from Wake Forest University, were teammates on the NCAA championship team in the mid-1970s. Haas watched Strange develop from a college competitor into something far more intimidating. Strange captured back-to-back US Open titles in 1988 and 1989, a feat that requires not just skill, but an almost inhuman level of mental discipline. The US Open is golf's most punishing major championship. The rough is thick, greens are lightning fast, and the course setup is designed to make even the best players look ordinary. Winning one US Open means you survived 4 days of psychological torture. Winning 2 in a row means you possess something most golfers will never have: the ability to absorb pressure without cracking. Strange accumulated 17 PGA Tour wins and led the money list 3 times. He won PGA Player of the Year in 1988. He spent over 200 weeks in the world's top 10, peaking at number 3 in June 1988. For Haas, the difficulty wasn't just Strange's accomplishments. It was knowing him personally, understanding his competitive fire from their college days, and watching that fire burn even hotter on tour. The shared history added layers of complexity to every encounter. When you've seen someone grow from a college teammate into the defining player of an era, it creates a unique psychological dynamic. Haas had insider knowledge of Strange's competitive temperament, his intrinsic intensity, the deep reservoir of mental toughness that powered those US Open victories. That familiarity didn't make Strange easier to beat. It made him harder because Haas knew exactly what he was up against, understood that no amount of preparation could fully neutralize Strange's relentless focus. Strange became the defining American player of the late 1980s, while Haas, equally talented and equally dedicated, remained perpetually in the shadow of his old teammate. That kind of proximity to greatness without reaching it yourself creates a unique kind of frustration. Nick Price brought a different flavor of dominance, one that emerged suddenly and overwhelmingly in the mid-1990s. Price had spent years building a reputation as someone who couldn't quite close tournaments, someone who would get close but falter when it mattered most. Then something changed. Price won 3 major championships, 2 PGA championships, and 1 Open championship. He spent 44 weeks as the world's #1 ranked player. He won PGA Player of the Year twice in 1993 and 1994. Those years represent one of the most dominant stretches in modern golf, a period where Price separated himself so completely from the field that competing against him felt pointless. You could play great golf and still finish second because Price was playing a game that existed on another level. 18 PGA Tour victories accumulated during his career, the concentrated burst of excellence in the mid-90s representing golf its most untouchable. Haas, who was posting top 5 finishes in majors during this exact period, Price's dominance was suffocating. Haas tied for 3rd at the 1995 Masters. He tied for 4th at the 1995 US Open. He tied for 3rd at the 1999 PGA Championship. He was right there, close enough to taste victory, but Price and the others kept slamming the door. Price's breakthrough from nearly great to genuinely unstoppable demonstrated a level of psychological mastery that Haas recognized as the ultimate competitive barrier. It wasn't enough to be skilled. You had to possess that extra gear, that mental switch that Price found. Haas, despite all his talent, could never quite flip. The transformation was complete and devastating. Price had overcome his own psychological barriers, and in doing so, he created new ones for everyone else. There's Greg Norman, and Norman represents perhaps the most complex form of toughness Haas faced. Norman spent 331 weeks as the world's #1 ranked player. Read that again. 331 weeks. That's more than 6 years at the absolute pinnacle of professional golf. He accumulated 646 weeks inside the top 10, 20 PGA Tour victories, 2 Open championships in 1986 and 1993. Norman was nicknamed the Great White Shark. The name fit perfectly. He was powerful, aggressive, and seemingly unstoppable. But here's where Norman's toughness becomes paradoxical and, in some ways, even more intimidating. Norman had spectacular public failures in major championships. 1996 Masters, where he led by 6 strokes going into the final round and lost to Nick Faldo, remains one of golf's most infamous collapses. Norman had other heartbreaking near misses, moments where he seemed destined to win and somehow didn't. Yet despite these crushing disappointments, despite the media scrutiny and public analysis of his failures, Norman kept coming back. He maintained his #1 ranking, kept winning tournaments. He kept dominating the sport week after week. Resilience, that ability to absorb devastating losses and still show up as the best player in the world, created a different kind of psychological pressure for his competitors. The mental fortitude required to bounce back from such public failures while maintaining statistical supremacy for years demonstrated something beyond ordinary toughness. Norman was proving that even spectacular failure couldn't diminish his overall excellence. Facing Norman meant facing someone who had already survived the worst golf could throw at him and emerge stronger. For Haas, constantly running into Norman's ranking wall meant accepting that even perfect golf might not be enough because Norman's baseline excellence was just that high. The psychological impact of competing against someone who could lose so publicly yet remain dominant was crushing in its own way. Nick Faldo completes the list, and Faldo might be the most psychologically demanding opponent of all 5. 6 major championships, 3 Masters titles, and 3 Open championships. Faldo spent 97 weeks as the world's #1 player and 473 weeks in the top 10. 9 PGA Tour victories complemented his international success, but Faldo's dominance wasn't built on power or charisma. It was built on something colder and more calculated, absolute precision. Faldo approached golf like a surgeon approaches an operation. Every shot had a purpose. Every decision was made to minimize risk. His game was built on error elimination, on making sure that even when he didn't play his best, he played well enough to win. The 1996 Masters perfectly encapsulates Faldo's competitive style. While Norman imploded, Faldo shot a final round 67, not by taking risks or playing aggressively, but by simply executing each shot with clinical precision. He didn't beat Norman as much as he watched Norman beat himself while Faldo refused to make mistakes. Faldo also maintained a deliberate psychological distance from his rivals. He once described the era as one where elite competitors couldn't imagine sitting down for lunch together, where maintaining professional isolation was essential for the ruthless focus required to win majors. This created an atmosphere of psychological warfare that extended beyond the golf course. You weren't just competing against Faldo's technical ability, you were competing against someone who treated every round as intensely personal combat, who deliberately avoided any connection that might soften his competitive edge. For Haas, facing Faldo meant facing an opponent who mastered not just golf, but the mental game surrounding it. The coldness of Faldo's approach created an intimidation factor that went beyond statistics. What made these 5 players so devastating for Haas wasn't just their individual accomplishments, it was their collective dominance during the exact window of his career he should have been winning majors. Between 1986 and 1996, these 5 golfers won 14 major championships. 14. During the years when Haas was at his absolute best, posting top finishes in majors and maintaining his position among the world's elite players, these five created an impenetrable ceiling. Occupied the top spots in nearly every tournament Haas entered. Combined total of over 470 weeks at number one meant that the competitive barrier wasn't episodic. It wasn't occasional, it was systemic and inescapable. Every single week in nearly every tournament, Haas faced opponents ranked significantly higher than his own peak of 17th. That created sustained pressure that extended across full seasons, across entire years of his career. Consider the mathematics of this dominance. Norman alone spent more time at number one than most Hall of Fame careers last in total. Faldo's 473 weeks in the top 10 represents nearly a decade of sustained excellence. When you add Price's 44 weeks at the summit, looking at a combined 472 weeks of world number one status held by just three of Haas's five rivals. The remaining two, Strange and Kite, spent a combined 375 weeks in the top 10. This wasn't a situation where dominance rotated or shifted. It was entrenched, institutionalized excellence that defined the competitive landscape for over a decade. The international trio of Faldo, Norman, and Price added another dimension to the difficulty. Mastered links golf, a unique style required to win the Open Championship. Collectively, they won 6 Open Championships. Haas, meanwhile, struggled at the Open. His best finish was a tie for 19th in 1983, and he never recorded a single top 10 finish at that major. The Open requires extreme shot control, precise trajectory adjustments, and creative adaptability to harsh weather, constantly changing course conditions. These three players possessed a versatility that raised the competitive standard globally. For American players like Haas, this international supremacy meant the bar kept moving higher. It wasn't enough to be the best in America. You had to master conditions that fundamentally challenged everything about American golf. Haas appeared in 22 Masters tournaments, making 19 cuts but securing only 2 top 10 finishes. Played 27 U.S. Opens, making 21 cuts with 2 top 10s. At the PGA Championship, he appeared 23 times, made 18 cuts, and again earned 2 top 10s. At the Open Championship, he played 15 times, made just 10 cuts, and never cracked the top 10. These numbers reveal a player who was consistently present, consistently competitive, yet consistently unable to break through against the barrier created by his 5 toughest rivals. The frustration of being so close so often, of making cuts and contending but never quite winning, defines the psychological toll these 5 players extracted. Haas's own mental toughness makes his assessment of these 5 even more significant. He went 3-0 in PGA Tour playoffs, winning under the most intense pressure possible. He's recognized alongside Tiger Woods and Bernhard Langer as a master of the short game and maintaining a positive mindset. Haas wasn't someone who folded under pressure or lacked competitive fire. He had every tool necessary to win at the highest level. These 5 players possessed something beyond tools and talent. They created an environment where psychological strain became as important as physical ability. They made winning exponentially harder for everyone else through their relentless presence and their refusal to give an inch. The paradox of Haas's career is that he was an elite grinder defined by consistency, while his 5 toughest rivals were generational dominators defined by peak performance and world-ranking supremacy. He did everything right. He stayed healthy, made cuts. He contended in majors, maintained his ranking among the world's best for years. But everything right wasn't enough when competing against players who spent years at number one, who won multiple majors, who set the standard that everyone else chased. The competitive environment these 5 created was ruthless in ways that modern golf fans might not fully appreciate. Prize money was lower, media scrutiny was intense. The psychological isolation that players like Faldo deliberately cultivated meant there was no camaraderie to soften the blow of defeat. You were alone in your struggle, facing opponents who viewed every tournament as personal combat. This atmosphere of sustained psychological warfare, combined with the statistical dominance these 5 achieved, explains why Haas would identify them specifically decades later. Looking back now, Haas's longevity and continued success on the Champions Tour shows that his assessment of these 5 players was never about making excuses. It was about recognizing reality. He faced a golden era of golf, a period when 5 players simultaneously reached peaks that few in history have matched. His ability to contend despite this competition validates both his own excellence and the extraordinary barrier these rivals represented. They were the measuring sticks of an entire generation, and for Haas, they defined what it meant to face the absolute toughest competition professional golf could offer. Their dominance wasn't temporary or limited to one season. It was sustained, systematic, and psychologically overwhelming. That's why at 72, Haas still remembers exactly who made his career feel impossible. And that's why his list of 5 names represents not just personal opinion, but historical fact. If you enjoyed this deep dive into golf's most competitive era, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which of these 5 players you think was truly the toughest. We're breaking down more untold stories from golf's greatest rivalries, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.